Hi, welcome to the show. My name is Don Walchuk, and with me today is Geoff Scott from Tri-Cities Community Television Society, and back with me again is Sid Chow of Access TV Community Television, and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So today I wanted to like Sid was on the show a while back, and we were talking about community television, and I wanted to carry forth that theme of a plan for the future of community television. And I thought, since you guys have been working in community television so long, who best to ask about what community television is than you two? So like maybe just give me a little bit of a history. Geoff, why don't you talk about your history in community television?
Sure. My personal history, I got involved in community TV shortly after high school, way back in the early 80s. And at that time, I would call it the glory days of community TV. There were offices in every community where volunteers, walked in and found staff who were there to train you. Not to the extent of BCIT, but they would, give you the basics and then send you off with gear to go cover community events, promote the community. In my area, it was kits, so we did, kite festivals and tea parties and all that kind of good stuff. And then shortly after, I went on to work in the industry. And about that time, as I started working in the industry, community TV seemed to crumble and disappear with deregulation.
Right.
And
that's about the time when I met you.
I think it was about that time.
1997, around that?
Yeah.
Okay.
I got involved with ICTV, as you know, and was eventually their board chair for a while.
Right.
And I live out in the Tri-Cities, so eventually decided that to continue to help grow community TV, the best thing for me to do was to start it in my own community as well. So thus Tri-Cities Community Television was formed.
How about you, Sid? How did you get involved in community television?
I got involved because some people that were producing a Chinese-Canadian themed community television asked me to come in and host and introduce them to the community. At that time, I was co-publisher of the Chinese-Canadian Bulletin, and I thought it would be great. It was great for cross-promotion purposes, so I did that. And when I got into it, I realized the potential of community television just for moving ahead agendas and for getting video done at that time. If you remember, this was just post-Expo 1986, and video equipment was not as plentiful. I remember we're using sort of the big cameras with the umbilical cord to a recorder and all that, and those were hard to get your hands on. So I realized, wow, here's an opportunity where I can promote the community, promote my business, promote events that we had, that I was doing stories on at the paper, and get them onto television. It was almost early cross-platform. And from then on, I've just been in it. It's been, it's hard to believe, it's almost been 30 years since I've been involved with community television, and lately we've been coming in, and I produced a regular show since 1994. So it just goes on, and it just seems to be part of life. But I just realized the possibilities for community organizing and using media as an organizing tool.
So when we talk about community television, for those that outside there, what are we talking about exactly? What is community television to you?
To me?
Yeah.
What it was when I came in, it was what I first got was community offices all over the Lower Mainland. I recall there were probably 14 or 16 community offices. There were 4 in Vancouver alone, and it was the getting together of people. See, I see you and Geoff and I as media. Individually, we're a medium. You live your life, and you look at life the way it is, and you kind of, if you want to call it, channel it, or you're a medium for whatever that reflection is. And so we are all a medium. We're the prime medium for storytelling. We're the prime medium for information. So you have your information, you storytell. Together, we are media, and that's the way I kind of consider how we do things. And I don't know if that makes sense to you. So I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm a medium. When I use community television and we get together in the studio and all this stuff, we're producing media, collective stories.
Yeah. Well, I guess what I was thinking of is that there's a policy of both community television, how television is supposed to operate, and there's various different ideas of how that should function. What are some of your insights about community television?
Well, when I talk to people who don't understand what community TV is, I kind of draw the analogy that we're basically a socially responsible film school. You know, we don't teach you you don't get a diploma,
Right.
but we teach you the basics, and then you take the skills that we've given you, and you use them, and instead of charging you $30,000 to come to our school, we charge you $30 to be a member. And then we give you feedback on the programming that you produce, and hopefully the programming continues to get better and your skills get better. And quite often those, you know, they eventually reach a high enough level, either go on to work in the industry or may go to school or to further their education. So it's basically a win-win for everybody. It's you know, an opportunity that afforded to the community to promote various events and community groups, and it's an opportunity afforded to the volunteers themselves for developing skills, and not only production skills, but, you know, skills of working as a team, all those other good things that come out of, you know, working.
Yeah. Well, I guess one of the things I wanted to talk to is that it's a regulated policy. Like, cable companies have to carry access community television. Can you explain a little bit about how that works, Sid? Like how?
Well, what happens, community television is one of the three elements of the Canadian broadcasting system. The first element would be called public broadcasting, which would include CBC, Radio Canada, NBC, Knowledge Network, and all the other publicly funded broadcasters. And then there's private broadcasting, which is pretty much everything else. That's the second element. The third element is community television, which is also publicly funded by way of a community channel levy. And that levy is to do what Geoff suggested, training. It's to promote stories that are complementary to the private broadcaster and public broadcaster. There's it's smaller stories in the community, things that are going on in the community. And most of all, it's supposed to be there to build communities. It's supposed to help tell the story of what communities want and the kind of media that they would never otherwise get from the private broadcaster or the public broadcaster, because it doesn't have the numbers. And community television is not about big eyeballs on the screen and stuff like that. It's about the community getting the training and telling their stories.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's different definitions for sure. Like there's so much, you're supposed to have so much local coverage and so much Canadian coverage. But I think one of the things I wanted to talk about is how that policy is always changing. Like we've seen, we were talking about the late 90s when the policy drastically changed, where cable companies were no longer required to carry access community television. And when that happened, they started shutting down offices, and well, that's basically how ICTV came about. We had to write to the CRTC and complain that we wanted to keep community television going, and we formed a cooperative. We formed ICTV so we could keep our programming going, but then Rogers started closing down offices, and then they started canceling our shows, and then it was taken over by Chow, and then again we lost more of our programming when Chow took over. So can you sort of explain what's happening? Like what is the process of making a complaint to the CRTC and trying to change those policies?
There's a very well-known complaint process. When you go to CRTC, all you have to do is do a quick search and just complaint process, and it's very, Well, I don't have it offhand, but the CRTC website is crtc.gc.ca, and just do a search for complaint process, and it's all there. And it's actually really quite simple. At least I found out. But then that may be a result of the fact that I've been engaged in that process. I think that in terms of how to engage the complaint process, I'm not quite sure now what the CRTC will do, because they're planning to have a community media public process sometime this year or early next year. And I think that's one of the reasons I'm coming on to talk about community television. I think the community should get engaged in community television, because there is a lot of public money at stake here. Almost $120 million across Canada of public money goes to cable companies to produce community television. And
well, that's the question I'd like to ask. Like, how is that money regulated? Like, who gets that money?
the cable companies.
And do any of the access groups get any of that money?
I don't think they do in Vancouver that I know of, and I can only speak about Chow. There are two other cable providers. There's TELUS and Novus, and I'm not certain what they're doing. I can say that I've been a volunteer with Rogers and then Shaw, not exactly Shaw, but through Access Community Television. I maybe received a total of 20 some odd dollars for parking because I refused to pay the parking meter for the mobile, and that's about it. No, they're very stingy along that line, along money going to access producers who bear the brunt of the download that happened in 1997 with the CRTC regulations that said that cable companies could run the channel any way they wanted, and they could even promote themselves and promote their services. A lot of that has changed in the last 10 or 15 years, and we're kind of back in terms of the access to the broadcasting at Shaw, but we are missing 15 or 16 community offices. We're missing, remember when they had a studio in Vancouver, they had a studio in Burnaby, they had other studios. Geoff will be able to give you of what community television used to be before that disastrous policy change 15 years ago, and we've been trying to catch up for the past 15 years. And I have to admit, you know, like Shaw's been doing, relatively speaking, a pretty good job because they're actually doing training. And Geoff can probably tell you about some of the stuff they're working with and what TELUS is doing in assisting Geoff to get training and all that going on.
Well,
so,
let's talk about that, Geoff. Like, how does Tri-Cities work?
Well, we go back a step and talk about the complaints process and just say that's not a path that we've really taken, so I couldn't talk too much about that. Okay. But initially, when the cable companies, being Shaw at the time, started closing down the community offices, I was actually an employee with Shaw at the time.
Right.
And I was not comfortable with what was happening, and I found my first opportunity to leave and work elsewhere in the media business. And I was very disappointed in what happened. But coming around full circle to what we're doing today in the Tri-Cities, and I've come to realize it's actually a good thing, and that what we're trying to rebuild now is community TV the way it should have been done the first time.
Right.
I'm a big believer in community media, and I think the CRTC was right to impose community television, but I think they went around doing it the wrong way. And the cable companies never should have been in charge of operating it. They should have been providing the platform and providing assistance, but the communities are the ones that should be driving it themselves. They should be in charge, they should be deciding what programming they want to do, and delivering it to the cable companies who then play it. And that's kind of where we're aiming at now. When I first went to my local city councils and said, well, we're looking for money for community television, I was pretty much laughed out of council. I was told that this is something the cable companies are supposed to pay for, and if they're not going to pay for it, there's no way in hell the cities are going to pay for it. So that was a bit of a setback. We started producing programming anyways, and we got involved with a number of community groups. And to date, we have over 12 community groups that invest $500 a year as members. And we're talking Chamber of Commerce, we're talking all the art centers, all the historical societies. I won't bore you with the whole list, but you know, there's a number of groups that obviously feel they're not getting the coverage they deserve, otherwise they wouldn't be putting money in our pockets.
Right.
So we've formed our own society, started producing programming, and at the point we're at now, the cities have all come aboard. Each city has given us $10,000 and are quite happy with what they're getting in return. And this last year, TELUS came on board, and they matched the funding provided by the cities. So they gave us money initially just to produce a pilot program, and then they gave us $25,000 to start conducting workshops. So we've actually conducted a series of workshops at the Port Moody Arts Centre last month. We're going to be doing a series at the Evergreen Cultural Centre next month. And we're still working out the details, but we hope to do a workshop in POCO in March sometime. Right. And then once those are done, we'll go and redo them again throughout the course of the year. So while TELUS isn't actually conducting workshops, they're investing money to help us to run our own workshops and educate volunteers and produce programming.
Do you guys have a studio out in Port Moody, or how does that?
Not as such, because we're operating in about a $50,000 budget last year. That really was used to purchase equipment. So our studio is my basement. Well, right, I guess that's not our studio, that's our storage area. Okay. But when we go out and shoot interviews, we will do it at Place des Arts, we will do it at the Evergreen Cultural Centre. We kind of mobilely set up in various community centres and do our interviews throughout the day there.
So are
just
you
because it's too far to commute downtown to Vancouver.
Are you trying to get a studio set up in one of these community centres? Is that
would be our eventual goal, to get a studio, whether it's in one of the community centres or our own facility. That will come. Right now we've managed to purchase over $100,000 worth of production gear, which, as you know, in production industry doesn't go very far, but it's got us 3 HD cameras, actually a 4th little HD camera for the newbies to be introduced to production, and we recently bought a TriCaster video switching system. So we're progressing, and eventually we hope to have studio space in our own community office as well.
Very good.
The one thing, Don, if I can add, what Geoff is talking about, the studio space, it's really important because you get a diverse group of people. You need physical space so that they can come in and have a coffee, so they're not rushing in and out and all they're doing there is working. Community television is about that. It's meant to be convivial. It's meant to cross-fertilize. It's meant for people with different opinions and different ideas to come in and talk to each other and work with each other. And they have one singular thing, which is to create a good show. And while they're creating that good, entertaining, informative show, they're working with each other. And that's the value, having a physical space. And I have always thought, in line with this, about community television, is that the things that are already publicly funded, like libraries and community centers, every one of those, given the kind of stuff that Geoff is doing and what's going on, should be a community media space as well. Getting back to the idea that you're a medium, I'm a medium, you're a medium, together we're media. And all we're doing with community television or the internet or radio and all this community stuff is amplifying the prime medium, you, Geoff, myself. And that's what that is. And so we need to really get back to understanding what media is. And media is the community telling its stories. And then when the community gets together, they're media.
Mm-hmm. But you need like you say, you need that physical space to have people to come together. And
it's great for us to be able to operate in the various community centers, but eventually we will have our own space. I think anybody out there that's got graying hair like us, or perhaps no hair, would remember the old offices. I'd rather be. Yeah. Anybody who's been at those old offices will recall the kind of the energies that were gathered there. Right. It wasn't just necessarily the production that happened there. It was people coming together, meeting, planning stories, planning the magazine shows on a monthly basis. That eventually will come. With more funding, that will be there.
And staff.
And staff.
And staff. They're like every one of the offices had 2 or 3 staff that volunteers could actually go to and get questions answered.
The Fraser office out in our area, which was, by the way, one of the very first to be shut down when they started systematically closing the offices, used to have its own studio, and I believe had 5 full-time paid staff members. So in essence, right now, I as a volunteer am replacing 5 staff people.
Yeah.
So yeah, we eventually need to bring in more money and start hiring people so that, right now the way the plan is, I'm going to keep going until I die and then community TV dies. But we're growing, more people are coming on board. I would say over the course of the next 2 years, I'm planning to build something strong enough that I can step away and it's not going to fall apart.
So you don't want to keep going when you're like in your 80s?
Well, I'd like to,
Yeah.
but I think there has to be a succession plan of some
Okay.
sort just in
Okay.
case. So that's what we're working towards at this point.
And I just want to put this in perspective. You know, what you're doing out in the Tri-Cities, Geoff, is just so remarkable. It's such great work. And again, putting this in perspective, what ICTV has been done, ICTV has carried the spirit of community television since the shutdown. You remember that all community television was off the air. There was a belief that community television could be done by corporations, and they kicked actually all community-based. And now we're returning back, and I think the cable company management on the community television level is realizing they're going to get more eyeballs by the community actually putting on their friends and neighbors and getting more people participating and doing what community television should do, which is help community build. And Geoff is a supreme example of how he's gone. And this has been, what, a 10-year struggle now, right? More than
easily.
that.
Yeah, more than 10 years. But
There's a lot of talk about that cable companies shouldn't be producing cable community television at all. What do you think about that?
Well, they should be distributing it.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what the channel is there for, distribution. The part I think you're talking about is on the cable bill, 2% of the basic package of the cable bill is collected by cable companies and sent to the government. Community television is a public trust.
Right.
It's publicly funded. And that 2% goes in and it's returned by the government to cable companies to manage and operate the cable channel. I believe that communities now are mature enough, community television, community-based groups are getting mature enough that cable companies should take a look at giving them a portion of that 2% public money that they get back to the community so that the community can decide and they can put studios where they need them. Instead of, I mean, my God, from what I understand, the only studio Chow has is the one we're in now. That's to cover Metro Vancouver and Fraser Valley. My understanding, though, is TELUS and Novus, the other two competitor cable companies, they don't even have a studio.
Yeah, why is that? Like, why doesn't TELUS have a community channel? Aren't they required by the CRTC to carry one, or do they not have enough?
Well, they're required to do
subscribers
training.
Yeah.
They're required to do all kinds of things. Unless you engage in the complaint process,
Right.
which is what Geoff and I have done. Well, not Geoff, but I have done. You've made a couple of complaints too.
I've made the occasional complaint. I'm more likely to go in front of the CRTC at a hearing and express my point of view rather than actually complaining about any particular situation. Certainly, I agree. You know, Sid has his angle of approach, and mine is a little more softer.
Okay.
I like to play ball and keep everybody happy.
So
Sid is
you're
more of a
good.
feather
So you're good
ruffler, I
cop
think,
and
but
Sid's bad cop then.
I think you could probably
Okay.
put it that way.
Yeah,
Okay.
but I'm getting more huggable and lovable these days because I'm not as strident and, I'm heading off into the sunset, so.
Okay.
I guess I'll have to start complaining more then.
Yeah.
Well, this is why we're on here, getting more people to come out, and we actually need the public to keep cable companies, accountable.
Right.
We've been trying to do that, those that have known. But you have to understand, and this is what I really want the public to understand, over $120 million a year, $120 million a year, that's not chump change, goes to cable companies for producing and managing the third element, the legislated third element of our broadcast system. And I'd just like to ask everybody out there, are you getting your money's worth, or do you even know what's happening to this $120 million? Because a Senate committee in 2003 could not find out how cable companies were spending this money. They were frustrated and dismayed. I'm talking about a Parliament Senate committee in the Lincoln Report said this. And I don't think we're that much further now. 10 years down the road, that's $1 billion. $1 billion in public money gone.
I can see how they'd be dismayed.
They're frustrated and dismayed,
Frustrated.
like we are.
Yeah.
Well, there's a group called Cactus back east, and they're sort of advocating for a community access media fund. What do you think of that idea, where that money would, instead of going to the cable companies, would go to independent groups to offset their costs?
That's all I can say. I mean, that's something is long overdue, really, an access fund. It's fine. It's fine for cable companies to keep. Well, let's just take, for example, in the Lower Mainland here, Metro Vancouver, Fraser Valley. My estimates are that Shaw gets about $6 million plus. Some of that hits the ground for you and me in the sense of the use of the studio and all that. But I'm not really quite sure. I would, because this is public money, because this is $6 million worth of public money, I think the Auditor General, people should actually take a look at if this money being well spent. This is public money. They do this for ferries. They do this, for anything that's government owned. It should be audited, and it hasn't been audited in ages.
Yeah. Kind of running out of time. I just want to know, if people wanted to get involved with Access Television, how do they get involved?
Our email is access
Right.
at telus.net, and just email there and say you're interested. We have a good team. We meet once a month and produce
And this is in
show.
Vancouver, right? We should clarify that.
It should be in Vancouver.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And how about you, Geoff? How do people get in touch with your...
With us, again, online, you can check us out at tricitiescommunitytelevision.org. It's a good place to start. Check out our website. We have a YouTube channel. I wish it was more organized. At this point, it's just been we throw our videos up there as we go and proceed on to the next show. But
There needs to be a national community channel website, I would think.
I could see that coming eventually, too, as things progress. I think there is sort of an understanding out there that community media is severely lacking, not only with the convergence of big media, but just with the disappearance of community television back in the 90s. And I feel it is making headway in the way back. Interestingly enough, for us in the Tri-Cities, the volunteers I have, the vast majority of them are people who have just approached me at events and said, I remember when there was a community TV out here, and I used to volunteer, and how can I get involved?
Well, I'm getting the wrap signs, so I want to thank you two for coming out today and talking about community television, and I hope to have you back sometime.
Thanks, Jeff.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sid. And thank you for watching.